The second reading is a continuation of the story of the call of Abraham to be the father and founder of the Jewish people. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will make you exceedingly numerous." Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan, for a perpetual holding, and I will be their God." This is the word of the Lord. Let us pray. Take now, O Lord, these very, very human words and transform them by the power of your Spirit into your words for us today. Amen. Perhaps someone here today has made a New Year's resolution to learn more Bible history or understand more deeply world history to gain insights into current events. And so I hope in some small way this sermon will help you fulfill some of those resolutions. I actually gave a sermon very similar to today's over 16 years ago, 2 years before I became one of your pastors, a month after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. 16 years later, we still need to understand the big picture and see that in 2018, we are still part of this great drama unfolding, where, as Jesus even said in the Gospel of Matthew, nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. And by observing the ups and downs of human behavior, the comedies, the tragedies, the greatness and the shamefulness, the peace and the war, the tolerance and the intolerance, the cosmopolitanism and the tribalism, I remain convinced, very convinced, that Christians, the people who follow Jesus Christ, are critical to a better world, to better human conduct, and improvements in our world in so many ways. There are three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, who all consider Jerusalem and its surroundings a very holy place. Many distinct and brilliant races of people have lived in, fought in, conquered, plundered, improved, ruined, and evacuated this troubled spot along the Mediterranean Sea. And so what I hope to accomplish today is an overview of the history of this, what we call this Holy Land, the Promised Land, modern Israel, for the last 4,000 years. Now, Jews call this region the Promised Land because, as I just read in the chapter 17 of Genesis, it was promised to Abraham and his descendants. Why God chose this land, known then as Canaan, is really anyone's guess. Abraham at the time was living in Haran, which is on the current Syrian-Turkish border, barely into modern-day Turkey. The Bible does not tell us that Abraham was desperate or starving up there in Haran and that moving to Canaan would make life much easier for him. But God did tell Abram, later called Abraham, Abram meaning exalted father, Abraham meaning father of a multitude, that it was a good land and that he would be blessed by it. The Holy Land itself has a variety of terrains and climates. It has desert It has fertile, watered valleys. It ranges in elevation from 1,296 feet below sea level on the banks of the Dead Sea to 3,347 feet above sea level at Mount Hebron. Abraham is thought to have wandered into this region around 2000 BC. And of course, the Canaanites were already well established there, and Abraham lived in peace with them, keeping a very low profile, but prospering all the same. And when Isaac, Abraham's son, was finally born, remember it took Abraham and Sarah a long time, and Sarah was quite old when Isaac was born, he sent one of his servants to go back up to Haran, to modern-day Turkey-Syria border, to bring him a wife from his own people, and that was Rebekah. During the entire history of the Jews in the Old Testament, it seems like a lot of the Old Testament is about the constant problems the Jewish people have in mingling with these other groups that are already there, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Hittites, and so forth. And a lot of it had to do with them taking on their religions and actually sometimes worshiping their statuary, and far worse. And then we know that eventually there was a famine in the land of the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and the Hebrews, with the help of Joseph, migrated in large numbers to Egypt so they could survive. And they multiplied in Egypt, but eventually they became enslaved and they were ready to be set free. And we know that the Lord's almighty help through Moses led the people out of Egypt and slowly through the Sinai Peninsula and back to the land that had been promised to Abraham. But this time, unlike when Abraham first arrived in 2000 BC, there were too many Jews, or Israelites, or Hebrews. The names are used interchangeably through the Bible, Jews, Israelites, Hebrews, for a quiet, peaceful settlement. The Canaanites were killed. Some of them were evacuated. There were skirmishes. There were battles to make room for the Jews. Joshua finally conquers parts of Palestine by 1230 BC, 770 years after Abraham's initial appearance. And then in 1125 BC, the Israelites finally, after 105 years of raids and bloodshed, defeat the Canaanites, but not yet the Philistines. And I'm reminding you that the famous Goliath was a Philistine. And then David, approximately 1000 BC, 1,000 years after Abraham, unites his people into one strong group and defeats the Philistines. In the time of David, Jerusalem, the great holy city, was a tiny place, 15 acres, 2,000 people. Very small place. Under David's son Solomon, there was a moment of peace and prosperity. But after Solomon died in 922 BC, the old divisions among the Jews between the north and the south resumed. Judah is the south, Israel is the north, and when neighboring groups began to attack, because they were not a united force, they fell. So the Assyrians, now modern northern Iraq, wiped out Israel in 722 BC, and then in 587 BC, the Babylonians, also part of modern-day Iraq, also known as Mesopotamia, destroyed Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah. So the famous city of Babylon is only 59 miles southwest of modern-day Baghdad. Most of the Jews were taken into slavery, imprisoned, and brought back to Babylonia, to southern Iraq. And there, in their exile, as often happens to people in exile, they rediscover their religious faith. And many of the books of the Old Testament were actually written while the Jews were living in Iraq. It turns out that the official language of Babylon at that time was Aramaic, and Aramaic is the language that Jesus spoke on a daily basis during his life. When Cyrus the Great of Persia, we call now Iran, defeated the Babylonians, the Iraqis, 539 BC, the Jews were allowed to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. This is the time of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Over 200 years passed, but the Jews never returned to the glory of David and Solomon. And then in 333 BC, Alexander the Great, a Macedonian, a Greek, replaces the Persians. The Jews rebel furiously against the Greeks and actually set up an independent state for a very short time until finally Pompey the Great conquers Palestine for Rome and makes it a Roman province ruled by Jewish kings. King Herod was one of those Jewish kings, and it is in the time of King Herod that we know Jesus was born. Jewish zealots led unsuccessful revolts over the next 100 years, trying to get rid of the Roman presence. Many Jews were killed, sold into slavery, not allowed to visit Jerusalem. Judea at that time became known as Syria Palestina, and the word Palestine actually has its roots from the Phoenicians, those seagoing people who are neither Jewish nor Arab. Time goes on, the Emperor Constantine is converted to Christianity, and he makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And in 313 AD, or we now often say CE, or for the Christian era, the Promised Land becomes the Holy Land, because it was the homeland of Jesus, where he was born, where he preached, where he died, where he rose from the grave. And then Christians from all over the world made holy pilgrimages to Palestine. And there was actually about 300 years of prosperity, security, and cultural advancement. Most of the population adopted Greek customs and the Christian religion. Then the Persians, Iranians, they come back. They're in control for 15 years. And then in 638, the Muslim Arab armies invade Palestine and capture Jerusalem. Now, the religion that Muhammad founded in the very early years of the 7th century was, for the most part, one of peace and wholeness. At least that was its goal. The original meaning of jihad, you may have heard, is a spiritual struggle to integrate all of life into godliness or holiness. And while it may be a shocking word for us to use, the mission of the church is jihad, to integrate all of life into spirituality, into wholeness, into obedience with God. Muhammad had not expected Jews or Christians to convert to Islam unless they especially wished to, and this is the important part, because he believed that they had received valid revelations of their own. In those early days, the Muslims regarded Islam as the religion given to the Arabs, the sons of Ishmael. Remember Ishmael, Abraham's son through Hagar, Sarah's slave girl, before she finally got pregnant and had her own son. Just as Judaism is the faith of the sons of Jacob, Isaac's son Jacob, whose brother was Esau and whose mother was Rebekah, who was brought back from the land of Haran. So what we see is something that we sometimes forget, a very important thing. Judaism, Christianity, Islam have a great deal in common. All three honor Abraham as their father. All three are the great monotheistic religions, worshiping the one holy God. All three arise from the profound sacred text of the Old Testament. And all three are rooted in the great insights and visions of the Jews, those brilliant historians, poets, storytellers, and mystics who came into holy contact with the holy God, the one God whom we all worship and seek to obey. So rather than evangelical fervor to spread Islam, what certainly inspired the Arab tribes to invade the Holy Land was that old combination of necessity and opportunity. The Byzantines and the Persians were exhausted and vulnerable, and the Arabs needed the land. And thus began 1,300 years of Muslim presence in Palestine. The Muslim rulers did not force their religion on the Jews or the Christians, as Muhammad had not, whom they respected as, and they still call today, people of the book. Despite the modern examples of Islamic terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, the horrors of Taliban and ISIS and all the rest, this was actually a time of cosmopolitanism, sophistication, and religious toleration. The Christian Crusades began in 1096, and they disrupted almost 500 years of Islamic advancement. And so bands of European, the only thing I can think of to call them, Christian extremists, Christian fanatics, set out to liberate the holy city of Jerusalem from the infidels, being the Muslims. It was their own jihad in a way. Pope Urban II riles up the people. Jews in European cities are categorically slaughtered along the way, beginning tragically what would be the establishment of anti-Semitism as Europe's incurable disease. And think about this, the horrible slaughtering of Jewish people by Christian crusaders on the way to the Holy Land 900 years before Auschwitz, a place where many of us from the church visited in October of 2014. When the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, and I now quote the great book of Karen Armstrong, Jerusalem, One City, Three Faiths, they overnight turned the thriving and populous city of Jerusalem into a stinking charnel house, a vault of skeletal remains. There were still piles of putrefying corpses in the streets where the Crusaders held a market 3 days after the massacre. With great festivities and celebration, they sold their loot, blithely unconcerned about the carnage they had inflicted and the hideous evidence lying at their feet. If a respect for the sacred rights of their predecessors, Miss Armstrong writes, is a test of the integrity of any monotheistic conqueror, the Crusades must come at the bottom of anyone's list. But the Crusader Christian presence held on for about 100 years. The practice of violent Muslim jihad had died out in the Near East, but of course after the Crusades it was rekindled. And then the Muslim leader Saladin orchestrated his own jihad on Jerusalem and enters as a conqueror in 1187. Saladin was actually a Kurd from Iraq who had grown up in Armenia. And ironically, when he took the city, the historians say, with some evidence of fact, that not one Christian was killed. Some were taken as slaves, some were later released. If they paid, they were ransomed. But the Muslims were scandalized to see many of the rich Christians leaving and selfishly refusing to use their own money to ransom their poor fellow Christians. Saladin is actually quoted as saying, "Christians everywhere will remember the kindness we have done them." And they did for a time. Christians in the West were uneasily aware that this Muslim leader had behaved, in fact, in a far more Christian manner than had their own crusaders when they plundered Jerusalem. Time goes by. The Ottoman Turks occupy Palestine in 1517, around the time of the Protestant Reformation, around the time of Luther and Calvin. The Ottoman Turks are in control. There's been a lot written about the Ottoman Turks, but there were 400 years there that were marked by mostly I'm sure it wasn't perfect. Stability, civic improvement, architectural splendor, and religious toleration. Jews and Christians remained in the Holy Land, safe and prospered. But then the Ottoman Empire declined. Anti-Semitism rose in Europe during the 1880s. Jews from Europe began to immigrate to Palestine. The Zionist movement begins, a movement for Jews to return to their Old Testament home and find safety from persecution. And one cannot blame the Jewish people for needing a nation, their own nation, as their own sanctuary, nor can we possibly deny their biblical claim, but I only point out to you that it had been 2,700 years, 2,700 years since the glory days of King Solomon. In 1880, 95% of the total population of Palestine was Arab Muslim. Christians too, Arab. As the Jews moved in and bought land, the Arabs, of course, became alarmed. Of course, many were adamantly opposed to Zionism. They were threatened by all these people coming into their land. It's not a large place. Aided by the Arabs, the British capture now Palestine from the Ottoman Turks in 1917 and 18. This is the great time of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. And the British, for the next 30 years, try unsuccessfully to keep both the Jews and the Arabs happy, to integrate this culture. The British wanted to restrict the size and power of the Jewish state so as not to infuriate their friends, the Arabs, who had been very important to them, and to protect their oil interests. But after the Nazi regime began, 62,000 more Jews entered Palestine. Jewish and Arab revolt broke out, lots of tension. After the horrors of the Holocaust, of course, even more and more Jews came to Israel. The British tried to hold off immigration, but just could not stop it. Shortly after World War II, the Jews organized and invented their own form of terrorism to get the Brits out. And in 1946, Menachem Begin and the Haganah blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 28 Brits, 41 Arabs, and 17 Jews. Eventually, perhaps partly because of the result of Jewish violent activity, the British became exhausted. They're tired of it. They turned it over to the UN. The Palestinians at that time still outnumbered the Jews, 1,300,000 to 600,000. But the Jews are better prepared, and in 1948, they win the battles, and the state of Israel is established. 780,000 Palestinians became refugees. From 1948 to the present, we all know this era the best. There have been many battles. There have been many failed treaties. In 1967, there was the Six-Day War. Israel captures the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and other areas. In 1993, not that long ago, hopes were high. A peace treaty was signed between PLO leader Yasser Arafat and Israel Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. But then on November 4th, 1995, maybe something that you have forgotten, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated after speaking at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. The assassin was a fellow Jew, a young student named Yigal Amir, who declared that he had acted under God's direction and that it was permissible to kill anybody who was prepared to give the sacred land, Israel, to the enemy, meaning, of course, that the peace treaty involved giving land back to the Arab Palestinians. So, over the last 4,000 years, beginning with Abraham moving his family and flocks from Haran up there at the Syrian-Turkish border down to Canaan, we can say with rough historical calculations that Christians governed the Holy Land less than 400 years. The Jews were the principal governors 650 years. Arabs, about 2,000 years. Pagan Greeks and Romans, 600 years. Turks, 400 years. Arabs, Persians, Turks, all Muslims now, have been by far the principal rulers of the Holy Land during the course of time. So, we take a deep breath. We wonder, what lessons do we learn from this? What do we make of all this? From the ironies and tragedies, we see the horrible truth that religions frequently fail to live up to their most treasured ideals. Christianity, the religion of love, has often expressed itself in hatred, violence, and contempt. The Jews who came to Israel to escape the horrors of Gentile extermination have themselves been agents of oppression. And Islam, the faith of unity and integration, has splintered into fanatical sects who have now killed thousands and thousands of innocent people who wished them no harm and were incapable of alleviating their bitter and ancient grievances. So where is our hope in all this? Well, my hope is not in historical progress or the politics of nations. My hope is in God. My hope is in God-filled human beings, individuals of faith, our friends, our neighbors, who continue day in and day out, despite the absurdities and insanities of history, to live our lives day by day, one step at a time, with reason, compassion, wisdom, peace, and prayer. And so we join with them, wherever they are, whatever faith they obey. Jews, Christians, Muslims, humanists, Buddhists, Hindus, in forming what I like to call a community of sanity, a community that will not and cannot, with God's help, fail to live up to our most treasured ideals. You're my community of sanity. I thank you for it. And because we have one another, we need not despair or fear in these troubled times. Today, we're also receiving the sacrament we call the Lord's Supper, or Holy Communion. And by receiving this spiritual food, I like to call it spiritual power, we are reminded that we can do all things with Christ working in us, and that we can unite as people of faith to build a more holy and peaceful world, even if it's just by simple daily acts of kindness, generosity, the fruits of the Spirit, sanity, day by day, one step at a time. Amen.